Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action. A very good morning to everyone who's got up to join us in the Asia Pacific region. A good evening to those who've stayed up late in Africa and Europe, and good afternoon to everyone with us here in the Americas. There's very little I want to say right up front in this discussion today, other than really to thank you all for joining us, and William and Erin and Renee for the comments they're going to make. And to say this, I guess, we all come here today knowing that what we're doing, whatever it is clearly not enough. There's so much history. I was on a call this morning with some colleagues in the UK from Bristol, and we've probably all seen the images of a statue being toppled in Bristol. What I didn't know was that the same person's seal was part of the University of Bristol's coat of arms, or its logo, etc. So these things are absolutely everywhere. These things are hardwired into so many parts of our lives. So I think with that as a very brief introduction, I'll hand over to Paul to introduce our guests more broadly, and we'll take it from there. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Nigel, for that genuine introduction and case for all of us to commit to deeper action now in the immediate term, the midterm, and the long term. Delighted today that we're joined by three guest panelists. Erin McClarty, based in Texas, is going to talk to us about the solutions and projects that she's helping lead, facilitate, and mentor. And she's with Erin McClarty, PLLC. With William Michael Cunningham, who's been leading and investing with a diverse lens, as well as with a lens for justice and peace and equality over 30 years. And Renee Morgan, who's standing in for Rachel Robichotti, who had a last-minute conflict, who's with Robichotti and Phillipson, and she's going to talk to us about your portfolio and things to watch out in your portfolio. I welcome Lucia Pullman of Hip Investor, who's going to moderate for us today. And as always, Nick Gower, who's producing this on Zoom and on YouTube. So I just want to set the stage before we get in. I want to remind everybody that there's academic evidence that diversity boosts innovation in companies. This is an academic paper from North Carolina State. So there's a business case as well as the moral, ethical, and human case for having more equality. That McKinsey has proven that companies who lead on ethnic diversity, gender diversity, and both combined outperform financially, so that you can help bridge this to the companies and organizations that you work for. And that in the census, we are a diverse country here in the US, and we're diverse around the world, of course. And what you can see from the latest US Census is that 60% of people are white alone, not Hispanic, which means that 40% of the population in the US is diverse in some way. And we're not even counting women in that number. So let me just show you a quick analysis to help set the stage. This is analysis of the Standard & Poor's 500, the 500 largest market cap companies. And what we did before this webinar was to analyze equality and diversity. And what we see is that 9 out of 10 or more S&P 500 companies have a policy on diversity and equal opportunity. But only 14%, and that's up from 5%, have set a target or objective for diversity. So having measurable targets for diversity is just one of the things that more companies can do. In the LGBTQ community, the Human Rights Campaign has an index about policies and programs. So we may cover some additional elements of that today. The average score has gone up over the past 5 years, but it's still not 100. There's still companies like ExxonMobil that are antagonistic towards LGBT community. And the number of controversies in the media linked to workforce diversity and opportunity, which include wages, promotions, discrimination, and harassment, has actually gone up in the past year. And so in the Dow Jones Industrials, these red spots here are the lack of diversity information that exists today among companies that we know. and are in the news every day. The good news is of the companies that are reporting, 40 to 41% are actually diverse. So for the companies that are reporting, they are representative of the US. But as we get into supervisors and managers, that's only 1 out of 3. And as we get into VPs, executive, and boardrooms, that's only 1 out of 4. And this is blending all diversity together, not only the Black community and African-American community, but also the Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander. So this diversity gap needs to get addressed, as well as solutions for justice and equity. And one of the ways that's happening is Apple Computer is publishing its EEO1 statement. And I'll just show you that here, because this is something a leading company can do. So if you own one of these companies, please encourage them to do this. This is a government required document for employers to file that show race as well as gender and who is at which level of the company. In the case of Apple, it turns out 50% is actually diverse. Intel is another leading example. This is the EEO1 pay disclosure. It shows you by race and by gender the income groupings. And so you can find this at if you look up Intel. And Chevron actually has an interactive site where you can look at, in this case, percent minorities among total employees. And we can turn this on. The minorities line at Chevron is just about 40%, but the proportion of other ethnicities may vary. So I'm going to stop sharing here. I just wanted to sort of ground that in. We need to act. We need to act today. Each of us needs to take personal responsibility and professional responsibility. So we are very welcoming of Aaron McClarty, William Cunningham, and Renee Morgan today to show us what's actually happening today and how we each can take more action and more solutions. I'll invite Lucia also to help moderate. Aaron, are you ready to go?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to introduce Aaron McClarty, who is a social change architect and attorney based in Texas. Aaron helps businesses, charities, and social enterprises change lives. Take it away, Aaron. Excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be talking a little bit quickly here because I know we're limited on time, but I appreciate the intro. Actually, Nigel, you can click to the next one since we've already covered that, but you'll have that in the slides.
Yeah, I may not be able to do what I was hoping to do. So
no worries. Do you want me to go ahead and share my screen?
Yeah, you go ahead and share your screen. If I fix my
problem.
issue, then I'll let you know.
Technology is always fun. All right. Can you all see my screen? Is it sharing?
Yeah, it looks perfect.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, good. You never know. All right, so we'll skip over more about me since I had that illustrious introduction. Just wanted to go over expectations, which it seems a little cut off here. But one of the things is I think it's always helpful when we're having these conversations to really ground and center and take note of anything that comes up. So turning off distractions and realizing that this work is purposefully uncomfortable and things may come up. There may be a tendency to be defensive. There may be a tension. There may be a tendency to become defensive or to rationalize. All of that is natural. It means that we're coming up against the tension that comes with change, the edge that comes with change. And so I would just be open to that, but also check ourselves when we have responses and make sure that we're engaging intentionally. And before I go too far in, I wanted to share a really quick story to help kind of ground this conversation. I was visiting a museum in South America, in a South American country, and it was my first time in South America. I was, my nerves were already tried by the time I got there. They didn't have listed how much it cost. It didn't take cards. The museum didn't open the time that it said it would. I get in, and even though the museum was marked as a major tourist attraction, there was not a lick of English anywhere. A little bit of Spanish that I was able to read, but mostly in the local language. And it was the sister exhibit of an exhibit that I'd seen here in the US. So I started looking out for all the traditional markers that you look out for, the signs, the videos, the headphones, etc. Couldn't see any of that. And I remember immediately thinking, there is such a better way to do this. And right after that, had to check myself and realize that I was having a moment around privilege, and I had internalized some pretty serious narratives around supremacy and colonization that were showing up in that moment. And it seems pretty innocuous. I have this picture of one of the paintings. It seems pretty innocuous, but you could easily change the facts there. You could change the venue to a predominantly Black neighborhood in Southwest Houston, and you could change myself into a predominantly non-Black institution, a university, or a foundation. And how often do they come in with their frames and expectations and things that they look out for legitimacy? And how often do they think there has to be a better way of doing this before really inquiring? Because I hadn't inquired. And what does better even mean? Better for whom? And so I say all of that because when we have these discussions around injustice and equity, so often there's this externalization of what others need to be doing and how I need to be organizing others. But each and every one of us have subtle ways in which we tend to oppress and can perpetuate oppression. And it's really important to acknowledge, one, that we are born, raised, cultivated, educated by, as Nigel mentioned, embedded in these systems designed specifically for that purpose. And I'll talk about that in a few seconds. And so these are things that we may not even typically aren't conscientious of, but they exist. And unless we're doing that internal work as we have these discussions to see, not is it what are others doing, but what am I doing to perpetuate systems of injustice, then we're not going to see the change that we're asking for. We're not going to be able to identify the subtle ways that it comes up in our families, institutions, workplaces, etc. And we're not going to have the tool sets or the humility to be able to acknowledge not only what we've done, but how we can help others who are having that realization as well. So this work is important in terms of understanding how we tend to externalize and needing to internalize, because so often there's a conversation around revising the systems. And to me, we really need to be talking about how do we redesign. In the book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, which is a phenomenal book and I highly recommend for anyone that hasn't read, the author points out that we are always designing. We are always designing, whether we are conscientious of not. Very similar to the fact that we are always having impact, whether it's good or bad. But we're always designing, and we design around the cultural narratives, theories, and values of the time. That's the case for now, but that's also the case for 300 years ago, 300 plus years ago. And so these processes and systems and institutions, they get passed down without us asking, what was the purpose for this? Why was this designed this way? To what end was this designed? And what were the prevalent theories and values at the time in which it was designed? So because of this, my focus is not on revising systems that technically, honestly, weren't built for me or the communities that I work in. My focus is on how do I deconstruct and then reconstruct things in a way that's inclusive and sustainable and regenerative. We're looking at what works right now, and seeing what exists, deconstructing that, and then rebuilding it in a way that lends to the end and the outcome that I'm wanting to have. And so what follows are concepts that I challenge, or I suggest that we challenge, redefining them instead of tweaking, case studies that I think are going to be helpful, not only with clients and folks and partners that I've worked with, but just general case studies that I've come across that I think are helpful in terms of talking about what are some of the solutions that we're seeing out there. And pay attention. What these folks are doing, again, is they're deconstructing these systems, and that thereby is creating the justice that we want to see. Because in deconstructing the systems, they're allowing an accessibility to build local ecosystems, to invest in businesses, to community build and build capacity. Right? So they may not be directly talking about justice in their language, in their websites, and even in the solution in and of itself, but justice and equity is an inherent outcome of it because of the fact that we're not building into these systems that, again, weren't built for these communities to begin with. So redefining philanthropy, I won't focus too much on this, but Dan Pelota's book, which I do not co-sign in its entirety, let me be clear, does have an amazing historical overview of charity and philanthropy and its historical roots. And in it, you can see and understand some of the dissonance that we see between what a lot of charities and philanthropy say they want to do and the actual actions that they take. And in questions I think that are important for those who are in those organizations are, am I centering myself? Have I centralized my interventions in such a way that folks have to come to me in order to have access? And then in centering them, am I centering them around my narratives, my framing, my experience? Am I generating and allocating wealth in a way that actually hurts the communities that I'm working in? And do I treat people of color in a way that basically I don't believe that they have capacity? Case in point, when you're working with communities and people say, well, you can't give that much. You need to piecemeal it, and you need to do check-ins, and you need to make sure that it's getting spent on what it's supposed to get spent on, because you know. That doesn't happen across communities. And so these are just little insidious ways, again, where it may come off as if we're trying to protect, but really what's happening is there's a patriarchy and some narratives there that are inhibiting and incapacitating those communities. In terms of examples to look at, the Heron Foundation has actually announced that they are taking their assets and grant-making decisions, they're disseminating that out into the community, so the community will not only be allocating those assets, will be making decisions around and prioritizing who it ends up going to. Someone else to check out is Fund for Democratic Communities. They're sunsetting in 2020, but I love them because they're not funding existing systems again. They're not tweaking. They're asking people to revisit previous systems, specifically those rooted in indigenous contexts, financial commons, land commons, and if not revisiting, then finding new systems to create the outcomes that they're looking to have in the communities that they're in. Something else I challenge us to redefine is capital and investment, because today's systems are built around, or today's systems of capital and investment are built around a purpose of generating wealth for a few at the expense of many. And questions that I suggest that we ask ourselves in our institutions is, am I trying to tweak a system for communities that were originally precluded from this system for a very specific reason? Am I trying to overlay impact onto systems that are foundationally discriminatory or perpetuate inequity? Do I perpetuate inequity through barriers in investment? Do I require people come to me and pitch to me in a way that I understand on issues that I think are important in the way that I want to hear them? Do I use inequitable systems around credit and collateral, understanding that there's a lack of access in many communities? Do I prioritize repayment, in communities that are still dealing with a resource gap? Folks to check out, I absolutely love what Co-op Capital, what Vanessa is doing over there. Fundamentally, what's happened is they have a credit union that has underwritten loans that then go to the community organizations, and it's the community organizations that actually lend based on character and relationship building. They had an amazing webinar this morning where I got reminded of this work, even though I previously had it in the slides. Exit to Community, check that out because it was pretty interesting. But what she's doing, it's they're deferring for 90 days now. There's 50% forgiveness for some of the loans. Again, you don't have to have the traditional sense of capital and collateral and assets, really focusing on Native, Indigenous, and undocumented. I mean, it's just phenomenal how she's turned the head on what we think of as investment. Same with Runway Project. Many of those projects don't have to pay the businesses. It's businesses of color, I believe predominantly Black businesses, don't have to pay for the first 2 years. In some instances, I don't remember if them or if it's the Real People's Fund, if the business doesn't work, you actually don't have to pay the loan back. Again, just removing those barriers and rethinking these systems that we automatically take and assume have to be, and thinking, does this really have to be the way that we do this? And then also just rethinking what is capital. So often there's the focus on the financial. In lots of permaculture literature, there's this discussion about the 8 forms of capital. And questions we can ask ourselves is, when we talk about wealthy businesses and wealth in general, are we including all these concepts, understanding that wealth and abundance is far more just than the financial? And are we holding businesses accountable to these things, this full spectrum of wealth and capital on their shareholder calls and things like that? And then lastly, just redefining assets and understanding that it's not simply equipment and money, but it's also things like, what do I have of value that I can make accessible to others to further their purpose, be that connections, network, expertise, etc. People to check out for that. There's a really cool folded beta. And basically what it is they're crowdsourcing knowledge around COVID. This came out months ago and I thought it was brilliant. It's a puzzle, but fundamentally what happens is in solving the puzzle, you may actually come across a way or solution for the COVID pandemic. And this isn't so far outside the realm of possibility. If you read Epstein's book about generalist specialization, most of the innovation that we've had around medicine, healthcare has been interdisciplinary. And so we may take something from the Postal Service, a solution that's worked, and we may throw that over here and apply it, and it may find a way to create or to solve a problem that those folks are having. Something else to check out is solutions journalism, which crowdsources just that solutions from the community. So questions to ask in terms of doing things differently. Am I asking questions of the systems before I perpetuate them, I think is most important in terms of what I want to carry away. Do I ask, what was the purpose of this? Why did we create this? Or why was this created? To what end was it created? Who does it serve? And how may I be protecting myself, my benefit, my ego, or my privilege by perpetuating this system? Doing that internal work. Equity, equity, equity. In all the discussions around injustice and finding justice, equality, equity has to be at the forefront. Am I a consultant, a foundation, an institution that goes into these communities, has them crowdsource these amazing frameworks, and then says, oh, well, we own it? And what does that mean? What does that look like? Is that in alignment with the outcomes that we're really trying to have in those communities to extract that knowledge and then again create that barrier where they don't have access the same way that they otherwise could, and then ownership ultimately. And do we prioritize imagination? We have to think, not even outside the box. It's, chunking the box, standing on a couple of other boxes, and then looking to see what we can find. We talk a lot about innovation. Are we talking about imagination and really just rethinking entirely what these systems and institutions have to look like? And does our spending align with what it is that we're saying we're trying to create? Am I supporting heavily subsidized, extractive companies, or am I supporting the local and regenerative through my spending both personally and in business? Also watching for unconscious bias. I won't have time to talk about it, but something I want to mention is there's so much of a focus on finding the right answer, and that's one of the reasons you don't see movement, because people are nervous about making the wrong decision. I'm not sure how to approach this. In the slides that you'll get, I talk about experimentation, because I think that's going to be key as we move forward, is people are going to have to feel comfortable experimenting and creating the grace to fail as we do try to find solutions to these very sticky problems that have existed since our inception. And then just one last point, if we're not doing the internal work, then it's more of a show than furthering a cause. So I can't underscore the importance of just looking internally and seeing what we're doing on our end to perpetuate some of the injustices, consciously or unconsciously, before we start talking about organizing others. And for those who are specifically Black right now and persons of color, it's important we do that work not only to identify, but then to also start healing. And then keep in mind, these concepts are really hairy and big, so it's going to take a little bit of time to really understand them. And that was what I had for the presentation. I think I went over, I tried to talk quickly, but thank you for the time.
Very valuable, Erin, really appreciate it. And so can you just one more time, I know you addressed it a little bit, just answer one question about unconscious bias or implicit bias, and if there's any best ways to help address that.
Absolutely. So I didn't mention them out loud, but shout out to Rakes Foundation. They're a great example, and they've actually posted some materials on this working with the National Equity Project. Fundamentally, what we're looking at is looking at our systems, our language, our frame of thinking, the way we communicate, and seeing if there's unconsciously ways that we bias towards our own privilege and perspectives, as opposed to empathizing and thinking about the barriers that we may be presenting for others. There's numerous examples of this, but foundations have been especially doing this work because what they found is, again, there was there were some assumptions that were sneaking into the way that they were doing grant making, like we can't give them money up front. We got to make sure we get collateral. Says whom, you know, and or we've got to be doing this a little bit better. We have to use data. But all of that was based on their own bias and was creating barriers for the folks that they were able to work with. And it was also really just preclusive. So National Equity Project has some amazing materials on their website around some of the unconscious bias work, if anyone's looking to do more of that.
And is that the Rakes Foundation, like Jeff Rakes from Microsoft?
Yep, it's Jeff Rakes Foundation. They originally were requiring that their grantees do it, which was great, but then they said, you know what, we probably need to do this work ourselves. They did, and they were really transparent with sharing what came out of that, and it was pretty interesting to see them talk about some of the revelations they had around the language that they were using and the barriers that they had unconsciously created.
Fantastic. All right, don't go anywhere. We have full audience participation and engagement here. Many questions popping up, but let's pause here, Aaron. Let's go to William next, and then we'll go to Renee, and then we'll bring all of us back. And then Lucia will expertly moderate us and bridge to all of your fantastic questions in the audience. But thanks for taking that deep dive, Aaron. It's really helpful. And to think about how systems were designed, not only recently, but 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago. All right, William, we know your video is not working. You look very sharp with that green tie.
It's a good picture, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fantastic. So it's good for your GQ cover. So you've been doing this for 30 years. Nigel's going to set up your slides here so you can give us an overview. Can you just refresh, can you just explain to everybody like the focus of your research and investment and innovating? Because you also have a book too, right?
That's right. So we've been, firstly, I'm Bill Cunningham, born and raised Washington, D.C. I'm an economist by training out of the University of Chicago. And it's always been my intention to help to cause a lot of questions about University of Chicago School of Economics. And that's what we're working on right now, because we think that half of the issues that we're facing come from a faulty way of looking at economics, or economics itself is problematic. And we are right in the middle of reformulating really all of economics. Aaron talked about how these things are big tasks, and they are. And you're absolutely right, Aaron. Don't be afraid of them. Just be cognizant of what's going on. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to solve this problem. That's actually what I'm going to do. That's my intention. My intention is to solve the racial problem that currently exists in the country right now by the end of my presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. And hopefully you guys can see the slides. If you cannot.
Yes,
okay,
we can see the slides. And if you're willing to share them, we can share them afterwards too.
Outstanding, and yes on that. So our economic models are based on what we call the fully adjusted return methodology, which is a way of calculating social and financial return. And what we've done is we've basically taken those, remember I talked about those old Chicago school economics, we basically have taken those theories and upped them to include what they left out, which was the social side of things. Now, I'm seeing a note that Knighton doesn't see the slides. If you want to hit me with a message or send me an email, info@creativeinvest.com, we certainly will make sure you get those slides. Now, our economic forecast from December 26, 2016 said as follows: under any conceivable circumstances, the current situation, and we were talking about the election, is very bad, and I mean toxic, for democratic institutions in general and for people of color specifically. Bottom line, over time, things are going to get much, much worse. Now, that's the forecast that our economic models were spitting out, and we basically stand by that forecast. Now, I will say we didn't know that things are going to get this bad, you know, just based on the structure of our analysis, though, we knew that things were probably going to get pretty bad. It also follows from our June 11, 2016 forecast that Donald J. Trump would win the presidency. And I've included links to both of those, the summaries that we posted on LinkedIn of both of those forecasts. So next slide, please. All right, we're going to start with a quick review of the ESG and CSR impact of the George Floyd protests. The map in the upper left-hand corner of that slide shows the location of protests around the world. This is very, very unusual with respect to the speed with which this protest has taken off. Protests in 50 countries and on every continent except Antarctica. Massive economic impact layered on top of the impact of the coronavirus. Our economic models we follow the Federal Reserve, by the way. We follow them pretty closely in terms of watching what they're doing and watching what their economic models say. And the Atlanta Fed is forecasting a 52.8% GDP contraction. We think that's right. Now, the other lesson from this is that you can't lean away from this. You can't lean away from anti-Black racism as evidenced by the death of George Floyd. You cannot lean away from it. You can try, but you got to understand this is different. And we think that there's an opportunity here to develop new investment vehicles, new ways of thinking. So next slide, please. This is our economic forecasting dashboard that looks at the impact of coronavirus, and it's updated to also include the impact of the George Floyd protests on minority businesses in general, but also specifically on minority communities. So I'm going to take a second and go over this. I'm going to go real fast. I'm going to highlight the critical forecast indicators. The most critical forecast indicator is that third row down from the top, that green bar that focuses on health. Don't know why this is such an issue or why it's so surprising. If you're dead, your job doesn't matter. So the absolute key focus for policy, for analysts, for what we're doing, it's in terms of maximizing social return. You maximize social return by focusing on the health aspects of both the coronavirus and also the George Floyd protests. So that's what's showing up in that box. Again, I'm going to kind of skip through this really quickly. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to go to that last row in that box, which talks about one of the opportunities for enhanced social return, according to our models. One of the opportunities for enhanced social return is via education. Because of the long-term positive social return impacts of education, its disruption also has long-term negative impacts. But given the way in which education works, given the natural curiosity of humans, this is also an area that is susceptible to an easy fix with innovations regarding the provision of educational services. And what I mean by innovations are things like this webinar, Zoom all of a sudden. But not just stopping here. This is just the easy fix for right now. There should be a call for developing innovative approaches to education and to repairing the breach that occurred based on the interruption due to coronavirus and also based on the George Floyd protests. So those are just two of the key factors. Happy to go over this slide. Once you get the slides, if you have questions, just email me. Next slide, please. All right, I said I was going to fix the problem. Here it is. How do you fix this problem? Hire Black people. It's not really complicated. Hire Black people, period. Now, you might say, well, Bill, which Black people should we hire? You should hire Black women. Why? The social impact from Black women is the highest of any of the current demographic groups in the United States of America. It simply is. And again, you want more detail on that, happy to go over that. Look at diversityfund.net, look at some of the things that we said when we helped to create diversity investing in 2006. With respect to social and economic justice in the US, Black women are the Navy SEALs and the Green Berets of the movement. You think Martin Luther King pressed those shirts himself or cleaned those suits that he was always so sharp in? No, it was Black women. The other thing is those were the people who were financing. They passed the hat at Black churches in the South in order to finance the civil rights movements. Most of those contributions came from Black women. So what I'm saying here is this: to solve this problem, hire Black women. Why? Because they have the highest social return multiplier of any of the demographic groups currently operational in the United States of America. In addition to managing their activities in the workplace, they're also, of course, as women are, responsible for households, raising children, all of these other things. So there's something about their innate productivity which leads to higher social return. That's what our analysis indicates. Now, the last thing that you have to do, going back to an economic perspective, which was encapsulated by Aaron and I'm sure will be encapsulated by others on the call. What's going on here? Whites receive psychic income from racist behavior targeting Black people. The compensation that they receive lessens the need to maximize income in other ways. Now, all of the economic data show that white people are living shorter lives, they're making less money, and they're also living sicker. So one of the reasons why you've seen an increase in anti-Black racist behavior is as this group tries to make up for the lost income that they've experienced through lower wages, the negative impact of globalization on wages and on tenure in the workplace, and also the negative impact of living sicker. So cutting off a couple of years of life. Basically, people try to counter that. And one of the ways that they try to do that is by getting an increased return from racist behavior. So what you have to do in order to solve that problem is simply lower the return from racist behavior, lower the benefits that people get from racist behavior. And we've seen a movement to start to do that. The young lady who called the cops on the bird watcher in Central Park. That is an example of how you lower the return from racist behavior. Now, there are a couple of problems here. Number one, that is too micro in nature. That's never going to work if you're going to rely on serendipitous incidents in order to identify and lower the return from racist behavior. What that means is that you need macro types of solutions. I'll post a link to the talk that I gave at the Congressional Black Caucus last year, where I outlined how you reach for that macro solution, how you actually get away from depending upon micro types of serendipitous types of incidents in order to lower the return from racist behavior. Now, here's the other issue. We've been through this before, right? We saw this with Rodney King. We saw this with, I'm old enough so that, I actually experienced the riots in 1968 in Washington, D.C. So we've seen this before. We know what happens. We know that there's all of this attention, there's all of this pressure, and then a month from now, nobody remembers the nature of the issue and things go back to normal. What I'm suggesting is that we need to take a focus so that we don't return. Things will go back to normal. Let me state that quite clearly. Racist behavior will come back to normal in the United States of America, despite the massive protests that you've seen. Certainly, there will be a reduction in that psychic income that I talked about. But remember, that psychic income fluctuates over time. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. That's what I'm talking about when I say that we've seen this before, and that one of the strategies that we're working on are ways to make sure that that reduction in the return from racist behavior is permanent, or at least is as permanent as you can get in this economy. Now, the other thing that we've done in tying to the investment thesis of this call, one of the things we've done is we have developed a tracker that tracks the corporate commitments to Black Lives Matter that everybody is talking about. So Bank of America indicates they're going to invest $1 billion over 4 years in entities and institutions that address this anti-Black racist behavior. Yeah, thank you, that's it. So this is the beginning of our tracker, and we're going to continue to track this. Shout out to Andrew Tabor, one of my interns. He's from Emory University, who put this thing together in about a day. I asked him to do it about a day ago, and that kid's special. He really dug into this and did just a great job. Thank you, Andrew Tabor from Emory University. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue to track these corporations to help to make sure that they live up to their promises. Remember, I talked about the cycle and how 2 months from now, nobody's going to remember this kind of stuff. You know, part of what we are hopeful of seeing is a movement on the part of impact investors, those who say own Bank of America stock, to perhaps submit shareholder resolutions and other inquiries of corporate management to get performance data on these commitments across the board. The other thing that we're doing, as you see, let me take a second and kind of go over this page. So the far left hand is the corporation. The middle column is what they have publicly announced that they're going to donate. And then the far right-hand corner is their net income in 2019. Now, when you look at this data in toto, here's what you find. Corporations so far have pledged about $1.7 billion to these Black Lives Matter enhancing types of efforts. If you look at their overall net income for 2019, however, that figure is almost $500 billion. So we've allocated and we just said we're going to allocate $1.7 billion. And again, that's over 4 years because Bank of America is 1 billion of that 1.7. But our net income is $500 billion. Here's the other reason why this is important. The Federal Reserve, remember I talked about how we track the Federal Reserve. All of the Federal Reserve's corporate support programs total what, 6.7 trillion? So it's not like these companies don't have an alternative source of funding that is unavailable to the majority of the companies in the United States of America. So any complaint that, well, Bill, we couldn't take all, so for Bank of America, we couldn't take all 27.4 billion of our earnings and donate it to Black Lives Matter initiatives. We're not asking you to do that. All we're going to do is we're going to take a look at that $1 billion relative to the 27.4 billion that you made in 2019. And we're going to add on top of that, whatever you get out of the Federal Reserve's very generous corporate support programs, totaling $6.7 trillion. So we don't want to, yep.
So we just have a couple questions here, and then we need to get to Renee.
Yep.
So a couple quick questions on the list. Are these 1-year commitments or multi-year commitments?
They vary. So again, in the case of Bank of America, that's a 4-year commitment, 250 million per year for 4 years. Some of the others are also multi-year commitments.
Okay. Are these, what kind of funding is this? Debt, equity, grants? What does this money mean?
That is a great question for the following reason. Here's what we think. The answer is, I don't know. Nobody knows because these companies haven't been very specific.
So we don't know if they'll get CRA or Community Reinvestment Act credits for the pledges.
They will try. They will try. But here's the other thing that's going on. In a lot of these cases, all these corporations are doing is adding additional dollar amounts to grants programs that they already have in place. Now, in their defense, what they've said is that, we're going to deal, we've got relationships with certain groups that are active in the space. So all we're going to do is give them some more money. I get that, that's the easy thing to do. You've got relationships with these groups. You don't want to risk doing anything new. It is also the wrong thing to do. There was a call for expectation earlier, and that is exactly right. That's exactly what you need. But basically, these commitments are going to be all over the place. They're going to be equity, they're going to be debt, they're going to be charitable contributions in foundations that they already have and with relationships that are already existing. So in that sense, it's not as good as it looks. It's not bad. It's not, hey, 1.7 billion, I'll take it. But just you should just kind of keep that in mind. Now, also, lastly, finally, I know we got to move on. We have posted a crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo to help support our efforts to create this corporate Black Lives Matter commitment tracker. And I'll post that link to the chat room also. So that's it. I want to thank you for including me on such short notice.
I appreciate you joining in on such short notice, William. And so appreciate the deep dive. Stick around. For everybody who's interested, we're probably going to go longer than an hour. These are important issues. They can't be covered in a TED Talk in 8 minutes. These are deep systemic issues that we're addressing. Okay, so we'll bring everybody back after we talk with Renee. So Renee, tell us who you are and what you do, and what drives that work. And then I can queue up your one of the things we're going to talk about.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and be quick because I know we want to get to some questions. And thank you, Aaron and William, for all your expertise and information. It's great. So quickly, I'm Renee Morgan. I'm the social justice strategist at Robichaud and Philipson. I had my own RIA for almost 20 years, Better World Investments. So I come from the financial world and as an investment manager and financial planner, rather. And speaking about supporting and working with Black women, I merged my firm just a couple of months ago with Robichaud and Philipson, primarily because I love the work they're doing, and also it is Black owned and run by Rachel Robichaud and her partner Maya Philipson. So I want to say something that may seem a little controversial, but I think I want to piggyback on what Aaron said about starting from within. And capitalism was founded on land theft and free labor. And in America, I want to speak to the United States. That's where we're based, and that's primarily where our screens derive from. And so when we're talking about wealth and wealth management and capitalism, I think it's really important for us in the investment world to keep looking within. If we're going to dismantle these systems, or if we're going to, as Aaron spoke about, like redesign and revision, this isn't about reform. This is about actual redesign and change. And that's systemic. Our industry is founded on the theft of 1.5 billion acres of land from indigenous people here, and about 250 years of free labor, free slave labor. So those most impacted historically are still, it is a legacy that still remains today and just keeps repackaging itself. And so that speaks a little bit to what I'm going to go directly to, which is our investment philosophy. And we do things differently at Robichaud and Philipson. We take the lead from social justice groups. And so what happens is we partner with people like the Poor People's Campaign, One Fair Wage, Native Women Lead. We have a whole slew of social justice partners, and we center predominantly Black and Indigenous run and led organizations, because we really feel, I mean, I truly believe, and our firm believes, that we're not going to solve the systemic issues with the same eyes and the same point of view that created them. So we need to talk to the communities most impacted by these systemic issues to figure out how to redesign. Like, we can't see, like, I'm white, for those of you that can't see on your screen, and I can't see, I'm not always going to be able to see racial bias problems because I benefit from them structurally. And so we need to take guidance from those communities most impacted by the injustices created by capitalism, frankly, and by all of the systems in America. But because we're an investment firm, we're looking at capitalism. So also, to piggyback a bit on what Erin was saying, we also believe in regenerative communities, regenerative investments in regenerative communities. But right now, our system is not set up to move all of, if we were to move all of the capital from the capital markets, we couldn't put it in regenerative, a system right now, because it simply isn't big enough. It's not big enough to absorb all of that capital. So we at Robichaud & Philipson, and we call it the Adesina strategy. So our Adesina strategy is what we really consider as transitional. We are transitional capital. We are a place for people to go to invest in investments that are looking at systemic problems and investing their money there till we can get to a regenerative space. So that brings us to our portfolio. We have always had a racial justice screen in-house internally. And with the George Floyd Fed Up uprising that's happening right now, Rachel felt really strongly about releasing it to the public so that everybody has access to the information. It's really important to us. So thank you, Paul. So Paul's sharing our screening list right now. Conceptually, I want to tell you that we are a divestment company. We do not, we don't really engage, we believe in shareholder advocacy, and we are thrilled that other companies do that. But internally, because we are looking at systems, we're looking at systemic issues, we just simply believe that systemically there are industries that we do not want to invest in, that we strictly divest from these industries and companies. So as Paul screens through these are, you can see what we're doing here. It's the ticker symbol, it's the company, and it's the data source of where we collected the data. Shout out to American Friends Service Committee, which has a great screen that's open to the public. It's AFSC/investigate. But if you just put in AFSC investigate, it'll come up for you. So our categories that we divest from completely are private prison involvement. And it's not just private prisons, like Aramark also provides food for public prisons as well. But if you've read about Aramark, like the example there is, Aramark is a huge food company. They provide food to amusement parks and places like that, many public parks and such. But they also provide food to public and private prisons, and it's terrible. It's like food that is not fit to eat often. It's so bad that Michigan canceled their contract with them. So sometimes the companies on here aren't just private prison related, but they are prison related. So we have prison involvement and private prison involvement. Involved with that is money bail involvement, surveillance, and surveillance, I like to refer to it as incarceration 2.0, because as mass incarceration as we start to decarcerate some of the mass incarceration, it's reinventing itself into surveillance. So, home monitoring, ankle bracelets, surveillance for folks. So those companies are listed there that produce a lot of that equipment, or manufacture that equipment. Immigration detention centers, you're going to see a lot of overlap between prison involvement and immigration detention centers. because even though private prisons are about 2% of the prison system, it's about 80% of the immigration detention center. And
So
then
Renee, I see BlackRock, which is a financial firm, State Street,
yeah.
Northern Trust, Invesco. So how are they involved in
Yeah.
prisons?
Yep. So those companies, the bigger banks there that you are listing or that you are seeing there, they are all companies that own at least $1 million of private prisons. So they're the largest investors in the private prisons themselves. So the private prisons, as many of you probably know, the two biggest public companies are GEO and CoreCivic. And so these companies are the largest companies that invest directly into the private prisons. And for our threshold, it's 1 million shares and above. And then lastly, we have
One more question, Renee.
Yeah.
These companies are in an index usually. So if you're buying a small cap index or a total market index, that's what you're buying. And so the reason why you might want to consider a sustainable index or an ESG index is that you need to investigate it, but they would more than likely than not take out private prisons out of that index. But like the Vanguard small cap index or the Vanguard total market index or any of those, that's what you're saying is the large investment companies are even indirectly supporting that through an index. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. And also, frankly, Vanguard's one of the largest holdings. They're just a private company. But Vanguard owns it's something like 3 million shares of CoreCivic and GEO. And then our last two screens, or our last two divestment industries are for-profit, based on systemic racism, is for-profit colleges in the occupied territories. So those are the industries or the areas that we suggest that people divest from entirely. If you're not divested, then try and engage those companies and talk about their practices, the racist practices within the companies in those industries. I'd like to say
Just
a lot more.
One question about the for-profit colleges, because I think you put it down here.
Yeah.
What is wrong with for-profit colleges? What is the systemic issue? Is it about education? Isn't that a good thing? Access to education?
Yeah, sure. So for-profit colleges are pretty egregious. They have a 20% graduation rate, and some of them are even lower than 20%. They directly market and target communities of color, often low-income communities, single parents, veterans. But it's because this is in our racism, our anti-racism screens. It's really the communities of color that they target primarily. And also a huge percentage of the money that they collect in like tuition goes to marketing. And that's often true for many colleges, but it's even significantly higher for for-profit colleges. And honestly, if you think about for-profit anything, for-profit is always beholden to the shareholder. And we think things like prison and colleges, education, health, those kind of things should be beholden to your well-being, to humanity, and not to money.
Got it. And on occupied territories, so tell us about that, because you mentioned earlier that it might be akin to apartheid. And one, tell us about that. And then two, is that something, since it deals with Israel, are Jewish people in support of or against of?
Yeah, sure. This may be in some ways one of our more controversial screens. First of all, I want to say we fully support Israeli folks and Jewish folks. But when it comes to this particular topic, we're talking about the occupied territories, primarily of the West Bank. And what happens in the West Bank is that the Palestinians are subject to Israeli military law, while the Israeli Jewish-only settlements are subject to civilian law. So they have created within the occupied territories a two-tiered system. So Palestinians are treated like second and third class citizens, and the Israeli settlers are treated as like first-class citizens. The Human Rights Watch has them on lock. It's also very much like the system of apartheid and segregation in the United States.
Great.
Awesome. I'm going to bring us all back together now for a little bit of Q&A. And to start us off, I think one of the central demands of this moment of uprising is changing one of our inherited systems, which is police in the United States, which has a really fraught story of origination and continues to perpetuate injustices on Black communities across the country. And one of the big calls of activists and allies is to defund the police. And Aaron, I was hoping you could just speak a little bit about what that really means and how not only government or municipal actors have a role to play in that, but I think Renee, as you're pointing out, there's a lot of ways that the investment space and also just normal individuals are contributing to this system.
Sure, and I'll cut it short because in listening to Renee's presentation, I was like, she probably would have some awesome things to say about since they filter against all of this. But fundamentally, yes. So it's something that I'm still investigating myself to fully understand it. I was actually reading on it this past weekend because I think the title and some of the narratives that we're seeing in the press isn't necessarily representative, Lucia, as you're saying, of what the greater movement is saying. And so fundamentally, the concept is, again, let's revisit the purpose for which a lot of the police state was created. Let's revisit the theories, the ideologies, the value systems that were prevailing at the time in which many of these modern day policing tactics were originated. I think the 60s and some of the various film probably has some good takes on that. And then keeping those things in mind, how do we, again, deconstruct and rebuild? There's this discussion about dismantling. And again, I don't know where I'm at, but I'm definitely for the idea of something is not working. And so the concept is there's a lot of case studies around the country of civilian-led, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be civilian-led, but other ways in which the outcome of keeping people accountable and safe and healthy can be achieved and not necessarily accomplished in the way that we're currently doing it. More specifically, having wraparound services that help the communities because, I was listening to a talk that's been viral. We have to ask why there are people who feel that they have to take advantage of a moment where they can get a free toaster during a larger, there's a systemic issue there when my opportunity, I feel, to get a toaster is at a Target when the window is broken. And so because of that, if we're thinking about some of the bigger picture wraparound service, community building services that need to be had in those communities, we won't necessarily need policing to the extent that we have it. And certainly we can be intervening in ways that won't cause it to get to the extent that it does, namely the loss of life for a lot of Latinx, Hispanic, and Black people. So defund fundamentally is, let's remove some of the budget. I think in California, I saw the budget is 1.8 billion. In some other places it's a couple $100 million. And so let's move some of that money, not all of it entirely in every situation, but some of it over to other services that will allow us to more effectively build relationships with those communities. It's kind of the bigger picture.
Great. Renee, I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit to what solutions can we be investing in that are aligned with a regenerative economy, and particularly thinking about restorative justice frameworks. Are there ways that investors can get involved in these solutions?
Yeah, so to sort of wrap up the question about policing, it's also something I'm looking into as well, because one of the things about policing is a lot of that money is public, right? Like it comes from the federal, state, and counties. And so for investors or for the publicly traded markets, trying to figure out where those entry points are, where are corporations supporting the system? Because sometimes it's not directly the money. However, activists, Napoleon and Ryan are doing some great work around thinking about how to target muni bonds. So if you're getting some muni bonds in areas with police brutality, voter suppression, that kind of thing, you can intrinsically add some of that to the muni bond. So there's some interesting work in the muni bond space. And I mentioned that because somebody else also asked a question in the comments there. Yes, that I think is actually one of the most interesting things happening when it comes to racial justice and securities. The other place I'm looking is as we talk, as what I'm sort of calling mass incarceration 2.0, as we go to this surveillance type of incarceration versus house prisons. Diversion labor is also something where people are being forced to work for free in some cases as they're doing their halfway house type. So I'm looking in that area too, as which publicly traded companies are supporting that. So be on the lookout. Our list is a work in progress always. And so that those are two or three of the areas that I'm looking at, along with some facial recognition technologies. So you asked a question and it's getting late. 2 words to remind me.
I think you answered it. You really pointed to 2 areas of big solutions where investors can get involved. I'm going to turn now to a question that was raised by Chris Gassman. And I'd love William, if you could lead on this. The question is, how do we know if we're making progress? Are there equivalents to science-based targets for racial justice?
Yeah, okay. So let me address the police question first. I would suggest that you guys, we are in the pool of non-fiduciary advisors to a pension fund called CalPERS. Now, as you know, CalPERS handles pensions for a lot of police officers. They have also been cowardly with respect to George Floyd. The reason they've been cowardly with respect to making a statement about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd is because so many of their members are police officers, and they've had this discussion. They've had this discussion about, there has been some call to penalize police officers who have misbehaved by taking away or reducing their pensions. CalPERS would be at the center. They would be the operational unit for doing that. So we want to engage with these pension funds, and I would encourage you guys to do the same thing, to talk about some of these issues. Now, with respect to the metrics of performance, and we're talking Black lives here, it's real easy. It's real simple. Black women. Look at what's going on with Black women. I live in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has the highest rate of Black women dying in childbirth of any city in the United States of America. The reason why Washington, D.C. has the highest rate of women dying in childbirth of any city is because it also has the highest rate of gentrification. And white real estate developers, the last thing they want, and I said this at the Congressional Black Caucus, the last thing they want is to have the population that you've just driven out of town repopulate. So what they do is they take away any resource that will enhance the probability of that repopulation. The key asset in that circumstance is a hospital. So in answer to your question, you look at all of the, so you look at, like I say, Black women dying in childbirth. You look at employment rates for Black women. You look at income for Black women. You look at healthcare for Black women. Those are all of the key metrics that you need as we found it over 30 years of doing this. I'm just telling you how to do this, all right? Those are the key metrics you need to determine the health of the entire minority community, because Black women are the leading indicator for that community. Does that make sense?
Totally. And I just want to echo what everyone said and just say, we see racial justice expressed through statistics. Look online, any quote you find around the fact that the 10 richest Americans, 100% white, US Congress, 90% white, US governors, 96% white. If that level of disparity in racial representation in our highest areas of power in this country remains so different, it means we haven't made progress. And I think looking at representation and power is a huge leverage point that we should maintain our focus on. We have another question from Holly Testa. Do you know what of the banks also lend to private prison companies? I think Renee, this might be directed at you.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure, and I'm not sure if they take debt. A lot of the private prison companies, because they came under target and under fire in recent years, have reestablished themselves as REITs, as real estate investment trusts. And so they're getting more investment money as people invest in these real estate investment trusts, as opposed to taking on debt as a single entity. It's a good question. So I guess the answer is I don't know, but I actually would guess that it's more about investment money rather than debt.
Great. Another question is, a lot of companies right now are reevaluating their hiring and advancement policies, recognizing that they haven't met their goals of racial diversity within their organizations. Do you guys have any tips of what companies can do as they're examining their own internal processes to make their hiring practices more inclusive?
Oh, I'll jump in on that. Black women. Look at it. Really is simple. It's just not complicated, you know, based on the analysis and the data. Look at what they're doing with that in that space, in that sector. Look at how they're treating Black women in terms of how they're moving up the ranks. Now, if you're talking about specific industries, the other thing that I would do is I would encourage all of the, if you're concerned about that issue, reach out to something called the OMWI offices of Minority and Women Inclusion. There are, I think, 39 of them in the federal government. The one that you should specifically reach out to is the OMWI office at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. They are responsible for evaluating the diversity performance of every bank, every securities firm, every brokerage firm, and every investment advisor in the United States of America. Of course, they haven't been what I would call effective, but the law, which is Dodd-Frank Section 342, is still in place and can be used to enhance the collection of information about diversity performance at financial institutions in particular.
I might want to add something here that just a counterpoint that, like, I don't know if progress is showing representation at the higher levels. I think progress and redesign, part of the reason that there's not representation maybe on boards and that kind of thing is it's designed that way. It's designed for access for white folks in particular, and particularly folks with wealth. I mean, the entire system is designed to benefit the same people that have always benefited from the system. And so maybe a better measure, and I'm posing it as a question, is not so much how the people at the top are doing, but how the people that have been most marginalized and the communities most impacted by these systems negatively, meaning they're not at the table at all. They're not economically benefiting from our systems. They're not socially benefiting from our systems. Like, they're being left out. Maybe how they are doing is a far more indicative measure of progress.
You were reading my mind, Renee. I was trying to find language for it, but what I wanted to make sure that we're all aware of and be thinking about, and I understand that in the specific demographic, it may be a tendency. I work a lot with engineers and folks, so I get it, is there is so much supremacy and patriarchy that gets wrapped up in prioritizing data, and in the ways that we collect data and what data we say is important and isn't important. And so while there may, and it is easier to prioritize data that is quantitative, I was just thinking, you know, ask a bunch of folks, you know, how is it going? Did you feel that this was preclusive? And so the qualitative data, really going back to Indigenous knowledge in the communities and asking them how they're doing, what their experiences have been, and really why wouldn't they want to work for X and X company, or why aren't they applying for X and X company, is going to be really important. I think the other thing, and I've had this call all week with a lot of companies who are looking at diversity and inclusion, is they keep leaving off that equity. And until you have ownership, until you have it to a point where I have ownership not only of the process and not only of my responsibilities, but I have equity in the company, I don't know that you're going to get to those numbers. Because again, if you have that wealth amassed, as Renee mentioned, and it's predominantly white male, and they got about a 400-year lead on a lot of us. Trying to catch up to that's going to be really, really difficult. So prioritizing inclusion, prioritizing equity at most is going to inherently create that diversity. But right now there's just that big focus on diversity, and that really doesn't do anything for you when you have a lot of different people in the room who have no empowerment or agency.
Thank you, Renee and Erin. I think that's a really important point. And the choosing of metrics can express our unconscious biases. And one of the forefront theories that's happening in the impact investment space right now is about impact measurement and using evaluative frameworks that turn the head of how do we impact by saying, this starts with a deep conversation with the population that we're hoping to improve the livelihoods of around what's needed, how can an outside actor support, if at all, and reframing the metrics that we think are most important. And as you said, Erin, stepping out of the center, out of that conversation. Going back to a more specific question on muni bonds, Pierre Garapon asked, I would appreciate any specifics on how to source impact of specific muni bonds. Is it by performance of state for geo bonds, or on revenue bonds, or at the school district levels, et cetera?
Yeah, Activist is really leading this. I would suggest that you talk to them about that, I'm sorry, just look them up. It's Frontline and Activist. There's a lot of crossover between Napoleon and Ryan, who's doing that work. So the answer is yes. It's sort of happening on different levels, and you have to look at where the entry point is and where you're positioned, and if you have access to influence it. But putting who gets the debt, what measurements of return, if you include, again, voter suppression, police brutality, those kinds of things. And then also who gets the money in the end, who does the payout go to? And those should be the communities of color within those municipalities. But they can speak in far more detail about that than I.
Now, one of the things that, again, I think this is a great conversation. One of the things that we've been looking at for the past 30 years are alternative metrics and alternative data sources. A quick example is the recent dust up over the unemployment rate, where the administration says it's 13%, it's actually 16%. And the reason it's 16% is because you can look at alternative data sources like, to mention a very bad firm, but one that has access to an almost unlimited amount of new type of metrics, Facebook or LinkedIn, or even Twitter or Instagram. These new data sources are very powerful in terms of getting information that you can use to validate impact. The other thing that I would say is that certainly you want to be careful with metrics. But there are these new data. We love blockchain. We love the blockchain technology and some of the things that are occurring there as a way of capturing and measuring impact in a little bit more of a secure way. But I guess my main point was looking at these alternative data sources, which we started to do back in the 80s when banks said that they could not lend in Black communities because Black people didn't have credit records. We suggest they look at things like utility bills and telephone bills. And that suddenly took off. Now it's a big thing. But we were leading the charge with respect to using these alternative data sources to measure credit worthiness in a system that, is designed to reduce the perceived credit worthiness of Black people in particular. So, and the last thing I'll say is that this is a tradition in the Black community. We have made a way out of no way for centuries, looking at these things in a new light. So hopefully we'll continue to do so.
Thank you, William. I'm going to ask one more rapid fire question to all of the panelists today. Thank you all for your wise words. I think in the very beginning of this talk, we talked about how I think, William, you were the one who mentioned that we need to institutionalize this moment and focus. And I'd like to ask all of the panelists, what's one company or organization or leader or activist who you feel really inspired by the way that they're thinking about this in the long term in terms of institutionalizing a new way of rebuilding a regenerative future? And I'm gonna just let y'all raise your hands because I know that was a big thorny question. Whoever wants to go first can take the lead.
I'll go first so that Aaron and William can speak last. I love the Movement for Black Lives Policy platform. I think they've done some deep thinking for the past 5 years, and it's a good broad framework where many people can go in depending on where you're positioned. I think it's vast and impressive. I also happen to love Amaka Agbo out of the Bay Area, who's done a lot of regenerative thought.
Thank you, Renee.
I wanted to see if I wanted to make sure I didn't get her name wrong. I fangirl over her, but I wasn't sure. So I'm definitely a fan of Vanessa Rowenhorst, who is she's a co-founder of Native Women Lead, Rowenhorst Consulting. She's actually the one that's behind Co-op Capital, which is what I mentioned earlier, which I definitely recommend everyone check out. And then Layla Saeed has been doing a lot of work just around this anti-racism that I think is really, really important to tie in with some of the internal work we talked about earlier.
All right, so I'll go last. I'm a fan of Andrew Tabor, my intern. Here's the thing. Black Lives Matter did not come out of NAACP. It didn't come out of Operation Push. It didn't come out of Urban League. It came out of a group of millennial types who recognized the inability of those institutions to affect systemic change or to even address just the issues they were having in the street. And they use the new technology to build a movement which is now global. The last thing I'll say is this. As I mentioned at the start, we are about changing all of economic theory. Economic theory only gives you two choices. One, some white Scottish guy who invented capitalism, and the other is some white British guy who invented communism. Those are the only two choices that the system presents you with. That is crazy stupid. There are a billion ways to organize the allocation of economic resources. Your choices have been limited in support of European and white control of the allocation of economic resources. So one of the things you need to do is to think broadly, think outside of those two, and don't put socialism in there. Socialism is just between capitalism and communism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about completely new systems, completely new ways of thinking about economics that starts with the recognition that your choices have been limited in a very specific way. That's what we're working on.
Great. So I want to thank our panelists, Aaron McClarty, William Michael Cunningham, and Renee Morgan. Really appreciate this deep dive into the situation, the challenges, and pathways to solutions and action for racial justice and for equity. Thank you, Lucia Pullman, for expertly moderating yet again, creating some deeper wisdom from your expertly crafted questions. Nigel, do you want to summarize? And then I have some parting words as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Paul. And look, I've been reflecting on all the positivity there has been in this discussion today, which I think is incredibly important. There's an awful lot of pain and struggle and difficult issues to deal with, but bringing a positive mindset to it and saying there are things we can do, I think is incredibly important. We clearly have focus. There have been some great resources shared today, and we'll post all of those on the website afterwards. And secondly, or beyond that, there are clearly relatively easy actions that we can all take. William put it very well: hire Black people, hire Black women. These are not, or these should not be, difficult things to do in a business. There have been similar points made about diversity more broadly. Just hire women and pay them the same. Again, it doesn't seem like a terribly hard concept. Clearly, it doesn't happen anything like enough in real life. There are obviously a lot of wider issues. I always appreciated Renee raising the issue of Indigenous communities. I've spent some of my life in Australia where there is perhaps more profile to Indigenous issues, but still many of them have not been addressed. And I think that's important. And the other thing that she brought up was the need to build the infrastructure to allow investment into a regenerative approach that's incredibly important. And perhaps some parallels with investment in renewable energy earlier, where there just wasn't an easy path for money to go when there was money ready and willing to invest. And again, I think all of that is incredibly positive. What I was also going to do just very briefly is to share a couple of books that have been mentioned, came up. One is William's own book, The Jobs Act. So very much recommend that. And we will put links up to that on the website as well. Paul mentioned one, Bias, which he might want to talk about in a second. Designing the Regenerative Cultures, which was also mentioned today. And one that I've started to read, Stony the Road, something which I think is going to take me some time to take in, because there is so much history in all of this, and I think it's important for us all to try to understand more of the history, but not to let that slow us down from starting to act. So, from me, a huge thank you to everybody who's spoken today. It's been an extraordinary education for me and very inspirational. And I'll hand back to Paul to close out.
Great, I will. Yeah, special thanks to Nigel and to Nick Gower for producing today, and to Doug Heskey of New Day Investing, a co-sponsor of ESGX. Let me just close out with a couple of actions. We like to talk about actions here. We want to be informed and inspired, but we also like to take action. So here's one: 75 things white people can do for racial justice, a 16-minute read, if you can spare 16 minutes in our time-scarce world. And one of the interesting ones, which I didn't expect to be the first one, is, Google whether your local police department currently outfits all on-duty police officers with body-worn cameras and requires that they're immediately on when officers respond to a police call. Massive transparency can benefit and shine a light. Just like the Washington Post says, democracy dies in darkness. Justice will shine when we at least have transparency, so we can see what's going on. A second one is there's a bit.ly. The bit.ly is bit.ly anti-racism resources. Very important point is about not being not racist, but being anti-racist. And being silent is being part of the problem. So it's up to each of us when we see these injustices to speak up, act up, and get engaged. Another resource is Kristen Hall of NIA Impact Capital has written an investor's guide to investing for racial equity. She has a step-by-step process of things to evaluate, so highly recommend that. That's only a 9-minute read. Of course, if you're doing something, it's going to take longer than 9 minutes. Open Invest actually has a cause and a filter for investing in racial justice. They have a dozen different filters and causes that you can allocate to. So check out Open Invest. And then Taylor Richardson of New Day Investing has started something called the Social Justice Book Club. So that's at socialjustice.club. It's open to all people, all ages, all races, all backgrounds, just like ESGX. So check out socialjustice.club, and there's a little mini survey there. And then finally, I do want to end on this because a year ago, I had the honor of seeing Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, a professor, a Black woman professor at Stanford, speak to several hundred of us at the Stanford University Directors College. That's where boards of directors of public companies come together, including having guest speakers like the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the woman CEO of Progressive Insurance Company, or the woman CFO of Google. And so in a packed room, Dr. Eberhardt told a story about how she and her young son were on a plane. And so there she was sitting with her young Black son, and a Black man got on the plane. And her son said, "Mommy, is he gonna rob the plane?" Totally silenced the room. And that's the implicit bias that cascades into our kids. So thank you, everybody. So please check out this book, and please address your unconscious and implicit bias. So thank you, everybody, again. Aaron McClarty, Renee Morgan, William Cunningham, Lucia Pullman, Nick Gower, Doug Heskey, and Nigel Lake. This is a special episode focused on solutions for racial justice and equity. Next week, we'll focus on roads to refuge, focusing on refugees. So please come back to ESGX, the place to be informed, inspired, and focus on action. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for investing your time here.